Hi everyone, welcome back. Let's dive into today's story. Major Marcus Miller stood outside the apartment door, heart pounding like the heavy artillery he had grown too familiar with. The dim light from the hallway flickered, casting long shadows across the scuffed floor. This was not how he had envisioned his homecoming, a triumphant return to a warm embrace. Instead, it was the cold metallic taste of betrayal that lingered in his mouth. He clenched his jaw, memories of the battlefield colliding with the bitter reality he now faced. The faint sounds of a child's laughter echoed from within, piercing through the door and stabbing at his heart. Chris, his son, was inside, unaware of the storm brewing just outside. Marcus pressed his ear against the wood, straining to catch every detail. A voice, Sarah's voice, floated through the air. It was warm, maternal, yet it carried the weight of deceit he could no longer ignore. He raised his hand and knocked, once, twice, thrice, sharp and deliberate. Silence fell inside. He heard hurried whispers, the shuffle of footsteps, and finally, the sound of locks clicking open. The door creaked ajar, and there she was, his mother-in-law, pale and wide-eyed, standing frozen as if facing a ghost. "Marcus? Good Lord, you were supposed to," she stammered. But her words faltered as she met his gaze. Something in his eyes, perhaps the steel forged by years of war, made her retreat into the apartment. Marcus stepped inside, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor. The hallway smelled faintly of lavender, a scent he remembered well, but now it seemed cloying. "Let's sit down, Mrs. Thompson. Talk like family," he said, his voice low but commanding. Her hands trembled as she gestured toward the kitchen. "I'll put the kettle on," she muttered, avoiding his piercing gaze. "Don't bother," Marcus replied, a cold smile playing on his lips. She flinched at his tone, and he gestured toward the table. "Sit. This won't take long." Mrs. Thompson obeyed, sinking into a chair with the weariness of someone carrying a heavy burden. Marcus took the seat opposite her, placing his phone deliberately on the table. The room felt suffocatingly small as he leaned forward, his voice soft yet cutting. "Exactly when did my wife and my brother-in-arms decide to bury me?" "Marcus, you don't understand," she began, her voice quivering. "Sarah, she was suffering so much. You were always gone on deployment, and this last tour, it was endless. She didn't know if you'd ever come back, or if you'd come back whole." Her attempt to justify the betrayal only fueled his anger. He held up a hand to silence her. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice like ice, "let's get one thing straight. Right now, you're not talking to your son-in-law. You're talking to Major Miller. I've spent 3 years interrogating prisoners, gathering intel, breaking them down. And believe me, they all started the same way, trying to justify themselves." She paled, sinking deeper into her chair. Her hands clutched at the table's edge as if it could anchor her in the storm. Marcus leaned back, his eyes never leaving hers. "You have a choice," he continued. "Tell me everything now, and you remain a loving grandmother who gets to see her grandson. Or persist in lying, and I'll tell Chris the whole truth about how his grandmother helped take his father away from him. He's a smart boy. He'll understand." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as she began to sob. The story spilled out between gasps and hiccups, a story of betrayal, greed, and misplaced loyalty. She told him how it all started last summer, with Anthony's charity project, Support Our Heroes. The whole town had been talking about it, and Sarah had been drawn to Anthony's charisma, his drive, his supposed dedication to the cause. But it was all a facade. She found out, Mrs. Thompson confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah found out that out of every million in donations, Anthony only spent a fraction on actual support for soldiers. The rest he kept for himself. And Sarah, she got her share too. The car, the jewelry. Marcus's fists clenched under the table. "That black Toyota parked outside. Bought with blood money," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "How many sets of body armor could that money have bought? How many lives could it have saved?" Mrs. Thompson sobbed harder, her frail body shaking. "Anthony said everyone was doing it," she murmured. "He said it was the time for opportunities." Sarah. She believed him. She thought. She thought it was the only way. Marcus stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He paced the small kitchen, his mind racing. The betrayal was worse than he had imagined. His wife, the woman who had promised to wait for him, to be his anchor, had sold her soul for a life of luxury. And his son, his innocent, trusting son, had been reduced to a piece of baggage in her plans for a new life. "She's planning to leave," Mrs. Thompson said suddenly, her voice hoarse. "After the next fundraiser. They're planning to leave the country." Marcus stopped pacing, turning to face her. "How much?" he demanded. "How much are they planning to steal this time?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Several million. For prosthetics," they said. "For wounded warriors." The words hung in the air like a curse. Marcus felt a cold fury settle over him, the kind of fury that had kept him alive on the front lines. He nodded slowly, his decision made. "Tell your daughter she's right," he said, his voice quiet but deadly. "It's time for a new life. But it won't be on a beach. It'll be in a place with much higher walls." The week that followed was a blur of reconnaissance and planning. Marcus studied Anthony's routines, noting every detail with military precision. The man was predictable, his arrogance blinding him to the danger lurking in the shadows. Every evening, he drove home along the same bypass highway, speeding in his flashy black Toyota, a symbol of his ill-gotten gains. Marcus knew the stretch of road well. It was poorly lit, with sharp turns and an uphill climb that forced drivers to accelerate. It was the perfect spot. Under the cover of darkness, Marcus infiltrated the motor pool at the base. The decommissioned vehicles sat in rows like forgotten relics, their rusting hulks waiting for disposal. He found the old N939 truck he had spotted earlier, its engine still functional despite its age. With practiced ease, he hot-wired the vehicle, the engine coughing to life. The bypass highway was eerily quiet as Marcus positioned the truck in the right lane, its lights off, blending seamlessly with the shadows. He checked his watch, 11:40 p.m. In 5 minutes, Anthony would come speeding around the bend, oblivious to the trap laid for him. The minutes ticked by, each second stretching into eternity. Marcus lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his chiseled features. He held it between his fingers, a habit from his days on the front lines, though he no longer smoked. At 11:45, headlights pierced the darkness. The roar of an engine grew louder, and then came the screech of brakes, the crunch of metal, the shatter of glass. Silence followed, broken only by the faint groans of the man trapped inside the mangled Toyota. Marcus watched from the shadows, his face a mask of cold detachment. Anthony was alive, but his empire was in ruins. The car, the symbol of his greed, was now a twisted heap of metal. Marcus turned away, disappearing into the forest as silently as he had come. The terrain, once a battlefield, now served as his sanctuary. When Marcus returned to the apartment, Sarah opened the door with a nervous smile that quickly vanished when she saw him. He stood there, clad in his field uniform, his expression unreadable. "Get dressed," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "We need to talk." Sarah tried to protest, her words tumbling over each other, but Marcus silenced her with a single glance. "3 minutes," he said. "And don't wake Chris." She obeyed, her hands shaking as she threw on a coat. They walked in silence, the tension between them palpable. Sarah's heels clicked against the pavement, the sound unnaturally loud in the still night. She didn't understand where they were going until they reached the wrecked car. "Oh God, Anthony," she gasped, lunging toward the vehicle. But Marcus grabbed her arm, holding her back. "Stand still," he ordered. "We're going to talk first." He played the recording on his phone, his mother-in-law's voice confessing everything. Sarah crumpled to the ground, her sobs echoing in the darkness. "Please," she begged. "Call for help. I'll confess to everything. Just save him." Marcus's voice was steady as he laid out her options: divorce, relinquishing parental rights, and atoning for her sins through genuine work for veterans. Or freedom, but with the knowledge that justice would find her, sooner or later. The wail of sirens grew louder in the distance. Sarah chose the first option, her voice barely audible. Marcus turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Months later, Marcus stood in a sunny park, watching his son pedal a bicycle for the first time. Chris's laughter rang out, pure and untainted, a sound that healed wounds deeper than any battlefield injury. Marcus smiled, a rare, genuine smile, as he ran alongside his son, steadying him. In another city, Sarah worked tirelessly in a gray workshop, weaving camouflage nets with calloused hands. Anthony, confined to a wheelchair, labored in a prison workshop, the weight of his crimes pressing heavily on his broken body. And Marcus? He had found his purpose again, not in revenge, but in rebuilding a life of honor and truth for himself and his son. For in the end, country and honor were not just ideals. They were the legacy he would leave behind. As the sun set on another day, Marcus watched his son laugh and play, the weight of the past finally lifting. Life, though scarred, was moving forward, built on the pillars of honor, truth, and love. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and redemption, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Lost Love Mystery. Your support helps us bring you more heartfelt tales like this one. Have a story of your own? Feel free to share it with us. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned for more stories that touch the soul and remind us of the strength in every heart.